for atheism, basically the problem of evil in an evidential version. Is this a good argument for God's non-existence? Well, I think not. Now, certainly, the terrible evil and suffering in the world is the greatest emotional obstacle to belief in God. But as philosophers, we're called upon to say not how we feel about a subject, but what we think about it. And when I think hard about the problem of evil, it turns out to be extraordinarily difficult for the atheist to prove, on the basis of the evil in the world, that God does not exist. We all know cases in which we permit suffering because we have morally sufficient reasons for allowing it. What Dr. Law would have to prove is that it's impossible or highly improbable that God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the suffering in the world. But how can the atheist possibly prove that? Maybe only in a world suffused with natural and moral evil would the maximum number of people come to freely know God and find eternal life. You see?
Well, okay, so, but then why is God so, bad at getting people to believe in him? Why are most people on the face of the earth not Christians? There's an easy way for God to get everyone to believe in him. Just provide people with such compelling religious experience that they just, they're led logically and inescapably to him existing. It's not clear how, brutal horrific suffering of the dinosaurs for billions of years before any humans were on the scene is necessary for people meeting God. Whatever God's goals are, there are much better ways of doing them. So that's just a general problem with omnipotence in the context of our universe that does not seem to be optimized for anything. But even this doesn't get out of the problem of evil. To hold that the world the world is better because malaria exists, because flesh-eating parasites that eat the eyes of infants exist. To hold that all of those things make the world overall better, it seems so inductively improbable, given the sheer totality of evil that exists. And it's hard to give an account of how any of those could be useful. Obviously, malaria is neither necessary nor sufficient for the greatest good. So why would God need to make malaria for the greater good? So the first point is just the inductive one. Second point is that if we think that God has a morally sufficient reason for malaria, then it would be bad to get rid of malaria, probably, because the world is better for malaria having existed. So Craig has to hold that every single bad thing in the world that we think of as bad has two implausible properties. One, that it's actually ultimately good, that the world is better for it having existed. But two, that despite it being actually ultimately good, though you should try to get rid of it. If you could go back in time and get rid of malaria, that would be good to do, because the spillover effects from getting rid of it, free will would be good, blah, blah, blah. And so he has to hold that that's true for every single thing in the world. But the problem is actually bigger than that, because he also has to hold that not only is the world better for them having existed, not only that despite them being overall good, should you not try to get rid of them, but it's also the case that God, that whatever purpose they fulfill could not be achieved any other way by an omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent being. So for all of the bad things, it is good to get rid of them for any individual agent. But God, who's an omnipotent agent, it would be bad for him to get rid of them, even if he used his omnipotent power to try to figure out the best way of achieving their purpose in some other way. And that's just flatly absurd. That's true for all the evils. That's the third point. The fourth point is that if we really took this seriously, we would be at nearly complete moral impotence, because if we know any moral claims, one of the moral claims that we know is that when an infant gets trapped under a building in an earthquake, that's a bad thing. So if it turns out that actually that's a good thing, then that should undermine our confidence in every single moral claim that we want to make. So that would lead us to near complete moral nihilism. 5, this obviously can't explain hell, given that in hell we're infinitely separated from God. So there can't be a morally sufficient reason for that. And 6, there just seem to be so many evils that just seem so implausibly explained by God having a morally sufficient reason for them. When the fawn, suffers for days on end with its neck with its leg having been bitten off by the lion while it slowly bleeds out, could God not shorten its suffering by a minute? Does the last minute of its misery really have some morally sufficient reason for its existence? And that just seems absurd. And now, And in terms of animal suffering, so, one theodicy that you might want to tell is that, God, those who suffer, God repays them in the afterlife. But Craig thinks that if you don't believe in Jesus, then you will not go to heaven. And so as a result, God's reward for the victims of the Holocaust is not an infinite, pleasant afterlife, but it's burning forever, either that or annihilation. So God will inflict more suffering on every individual Holocaust victim than the sum total of all the Nazis did. Each Holocaust victim will endure more suffering at the hands of God than they will have than Holocaust victims did collectively at the hands of the Nazis. That's not the action of a perfectly good and all-loving God. That's the action of a horrendous despot. Now, this only applies to Craig's view. So if you hold that everyone will be saved, etc., it doesn't apply to your view. But what about animal suffering? Well, the animals wouldn't be. So if the animals are repaid in the afterlife, well, animals don't have free will. Many of them don't, like fish certainly don't. They just sort of act based on instinct. And animals, the soul-building theodicy just does not make much sense in terms of animals getting rewarded in the afterlife, right? I mean, if you have a fish who's suffering horrifically, and so you say that the purpose of that is to rebuild their soul in the afterlife. Well, in the afterlife, will they remain sort of like a fish, or will they become like a souped up fish? Will they become like super wise and knowledgeable and such? If they just remain like a fish, well, then it seems like they can't really gain the rewards of heaven. They can't really experience, deep enlightenment or any of the other things in heaven. They'll just experience sort of senseless, trivial pleasure, which I think Craig would say that's not the purpose of heaven. And yet if they achieve, deep, everlasting enlightenment and become like, incredibly wise in heaven, well, then how the hell did it build their soul to be a fish on earth, right? If, living for 3 hours as a fish before getting eaten by a big fish does not train you to be a fish scholar in the afterlife.